He was covered in blood, surrounded by the dead, with no faith, no strength, no future. Sitting in a frozen trench, he held a pistol with a single bullet. He was ready to end it all, until he saw something inside his wallet. A photograph, a smile, a reason. This is the true story of Emil Hartmann, a soldier who lost everything in the war, except one memory. And that, just that, was enough to stop him from pulling the trigger. If you've ever felt like you were at the edge, if you've ever thought no one could understand the weight of losing your purpose, this story is for you, because sometimes what saves a life is just a picture. If you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, hit that subscribe button now, not just for the algorithm, but to help us keep these memories alive. You're not just watching history, you're carrying it forward. The last photo in the wallet, the portrait that stopped a suicide on the front lines. Have you ever held a photo so tightly it felt like you were holding on to life itself? He had. His name was Emil Hartmann. He was 22 years old, living on the outskirts of Dresden, Germany, working as a cobbler in his father's shop. His world was small, the steady rhythm of hammer and leather, cobblestone streets, the sound of church bells on Sunday mornings. But within that quiet world, there was someone who made it feel infinite. Lotta. The kind of woman who laughed with her eyes and made coffee while humming Edith Piaf on a French radio her cousin had brought. Back from Paris, she was his entire reason for waking up each morning. And in the summer of 1942, just before the war pulled him away, Emil asked a photographer to capture her. Old style, her sitting on a park bench, smiling in a navy blue dress, the late sunlight tracing her face like even time had paused to admire her. On the back of that photo, she wrote with ink pen, "Come back to me." When the call-up letter from the Reich arrived, orders to the Eastern Front, Emil didn't cry. Not in front of her. He just folded the photo, tucked it into his worn leather wallet, and clung to it like it was the last piece of home he could carry. At the train station, when the whistle blew and smoke hissed from the engine, he looked at Lotta one last time and tried to memorize every detail of her face. What he didn't know, couldn't know, was that this photo wasn't just a memory. It would become his anchor, his shield, his last line of defense when the world tried to strip him of everything, including his will to live. There are things the human mind was never meant to witness, things that rot you from the inside, slowly, silently, like rust spreading through steel. That's what the Eastern Front was. Not just a battlefield, but a machine built to crush spirit, memory, even the idea of mercy. And in the middle of it stood Emil Hartmann, once a cobbler with hands made for shaping leather, now a soldier with shaking fingers stained with blood and dirt that never washed off. The year was 1943. The winter had already come and refused to leave. Snow covered everything, the trees, the trenches, the bodies. At first, Emil had tried to count the dead. Not the enemy, his friends. Wilhelm, the joker from Cologne. Otto, who used to draw tiny cartoons in his pocketbook. Even Becker, the stern one, who never smiled but once gave Emil his last cigarette. One by one, they vanished. Shattered by mortars, ripped apart by machine gun fire, frozen overnight like statues with open eyes. After a while, Emil stopped counting. He stopped speaking much, too. The only sound that mattered now was the distant rumble of Soviet tanks and the crackling whispers of the cold slipping through every seam of his uniform. They had been posted near Kharkov, in Ukraine, a place that looked like the edge of the world. Bombed villages, empty fields, silence so vast it rang in your ears. Command ordered them to hold a line no one believed in anymore. Supplies came late, if at all. Boots had holes. Canned meat turned sour. Water froze inside their flasks. But worse than the cold or the hunger was the waiting for the next shell, waiting for the next order to run across open land into machine gun nests, waiting for the moment your luck ran out. Emil still kept Lotta's photo close. He no longer dared look at it every day. It hurt too much. It was like staring at a dream you could never return to. He only glanced at it in secret, during the brief moments between horror and exhaustion, when no one could see the tears he didn't understand anymore. Her face was getting softer, faded, like the light in his eyes. One night, during a lull in the fighting, he held it under his blanket and whispered, "I'm not the man in that photo anymore." He meant it, because the man she loved, the one who brought her flowers wrapped in newspaper, who kissed her fingertips on the church steps, that man was being buried here, inch by inch, in Ukrainian mud. Then came the worst week. Their company was ambushed near the Dnieper River. A Soviet artillery barrage tore through the tree line like fire through paper. Emil remembers diving into a crater already filled with the dead. He doesn't remember how long he stayed there. When he emerged, his ears were ringing, and his hands were trembling so badly he couldn't reload his rifle. Around him, smoke and screams blurred into one sickening symphony. Medics weren't coming. Orders were a distant echo. Survival became instinct. Crawl, hide, breathe, repeat. In that chaos, something inside Emil began to go numb. Not just fear, not just grief, something deeper, like his soul was retreating, curling up in a corner somewhere far away. He found himself staring at his own hands and not recognizing them. He thought, "I am disappearing." At night, he'd lie, awake, listening to the men cry in their sleep. Some screamed for their mothers, others for women they loved. One even prayed aloud for death, not out of despair, but as if it were mercy. Emil didn't pray. He didn't believe anymore. Not in God, not in the cause, not even in making it home. But he kept the photo, not because he had hope, but because he didn't know what to do with the last piece of a world that had been kind. One dawn, after 3 days without sleep, Emil sat on a crate beside what was left of a barn. A thin layer of frost had covered everything. In the grey light, he watched a fellow soldier, barely 18, trying to warm his fingers by lighting pages torn from a pocket Bible. The boy looked at Emil and asked, "Do you think we'll ever leave this place?" Emil wanted to lie, say something like, "Yes, of course," but the words refused to come. He just nodded, then looked down at his lap and realized he had the photo in his hand again. Lotta's smile, that navy blue dress, the handwriting on. The back was smudged now, but still legible. "Come back to me." He almost laughed. Come back to what? The Emil she knew no longer existed. That was the day he stopped writing letters. He couldn't face her in words anymore. Couldn't pretend. He was okay. Couldn't fake hope. His last letter ended mid-sentence, and he never mailed it. By the end of that week, Emil had made a decision. A quiet one. No drama, no goodbye. Just a plan. One bullet, one night. No more pain. But the front had one more thing to show him. Something cruel, or maybe something holy. Some nights come colder than death. No gunfire, no commands. Just the silence, heavy, thick, like the war itself was holding its breath. That night, Emil Hartmann sat alone in a ruined watchpost outside Poltava. The others had rotated, out for rest. He volunteered to stay, said he didn't mind the cold, said he needed the quiet. The truth was simpler, darker. He'd made a decision. He had one bullet saved, not for the enemy, for himself. It wasn't fear that brought him here. It wasn't even grief anymore. It was emptiness, a black, bottomless kind that no food, no warmth, no promise could fill. He felt like a man already dead, just waiting for his body to catch up. The kind of dead where your dreams stop showing people's faces, where your own voice sounds like someone else's. He took out the pistol, cleaned it like a ritual, slowly, precisely, like he used to polish shoes as a boy. There was no note, no ceremony, just the photo, still folded in his wallet. For some reason, he wanted to look at her one last time, not for hope, not even for comfort, just to remember what it felt like to be human. He unfolded the photograph. The edges were worn now, soft as cloth. Lotta's face stared back at him through time, that quiet, open smile, like she knew something he didn't. He stared at it for a long time. At first, nothing happened. Then, his eyes caught a detail he'd never noticed before. In the corner of the image, behind her on the bench, a small boy, blurred, almost out of frame, was tossing breadcrumbs to pigeons. That boy wasn't part of the photo shoot. Emil remembered now. He had been so focused on Lotta, he'd never paid attention to anything else. But now, in this final moment, that forgotten boy pulled something loose in his chest. Something real, and suddenly he heard a sound, not from the trenches, not from outside, from somewhere deep inside himself. Laughter, faint, broken, but real. He remembered that afternoon. The boy had made Lotta laugh, a sudden, unguarded laugh that shook her shoulders and made Emil turn to her just before the shutter clicked. That was the moment frozen forever. Not just a posed smile, but the echo of life itself. Joy, spontaneous and fragile. He could hear it again now, like it was happening in the room. And for the first time in months, Emil felt something. Not peace, not strength, but something alive, a flicker, a tremor, enough to make him lower the pistol, just a little. His breath caught. Hands shaking, he pressed the photo to his chest and whispered her name. Lotta. That's when the wind picked up. A low whistle through the gaps in the wall. It sounded like a voice, or maybe his mind was playing tricks. But in that moment, Emil thought he heard it. Her voice, or the memory of it, saying the same words written on the back of the photo. Come back to me. He dropped the pistol. It hit the ground with a soft metallic thud, but it may as well have been thunder. The silence that followed felt different, like the earth had just tilted a few degrees, like death had taken a step back. For now, that night, Emil didn't sleep, but he didn't take his life either. He just sat there, with Lotta's image pressed to his chest and a heart not quite whole, but no longer hollow. And when the sun finally rose, pale and reluctant through the frostbitten trees, Emil Hartmann was still alive, changed, cracked, scarred beyond words, but breathing and ready somehow to face one more day. The sun came up like it had something to prove. It didn't rise gently that morning. It pushed itself over the horizon, bleeding pale light across the ruined fields. Like a warning, you're still here, you're not done yet. Emil Hartmann blinked into that fragile brightness, his back stiff from the cold, the photo of Lotta still clutched in his coat. His pistol lay untouched at his feet. The choice he didn't make was the one that saved him. But the war didn't. Don't care about choices. The war had its own plans. That same morning, Soviet artillery returned, loud, erratic, closer than usual. Emil scrambled from the outpost just as a shell tore through the roof, turning the place where he almost died by his own hand into a smoking crater. He didn't have time to think. Orders were shouted, boots slammed through mud. The retreat began. It wasn't a retreat in the official sense. No one ever used that word. But they all knew. Kharkov was slipping. The Red Army was stronger now, more men, more tanks, endless supplies. The Germans were burning fuel, lives and ground just to slow them down. Emil ran with what was left of his unit, weaving through charred trees and frozen streams, eating snow to stay hydrated. He carried no extra gear, just ammunition. And the photo. They fought for another week. A week of ambushes, of whispers in pine forests, of watching the faces around him disappear one by one. One man bled out in Emil's lap, choking on his own teeth. Another simply walked into the fog and never returned. But something had changed in Emil. He wasn't fighting to win anymore. He wasn't even fighting to survive. He was fighting to return. That word, return, became his anchor. "I will crawl if I have to," he told himself. "I will see her again." Then came the wound. It happened fast. A firefight outside a collapsed farmhouse. Emil ducked too slow. A burst of shrapnel tore into his shoulder, spun him backward into the snow. The pain was instant and total. It blinded him. He felt heat, then cold, then nothing. As voices faded, he reached for his wallet with what little strength he had left. Lotta's face. That was all he wanted to see before blacking out. When he woke, it was night. Someone had dragged him behind a wall. His wound was bandaged, badly. Blood soaked through the fabric. He couldn't move his arm, couldn't tell if he'd been left behind or spared. He faded in and out of consciousness, clinging to a single thread of thought. Just one more day, then another. On the third day, a miracle arrived. Or at least the closest thing to one in that hell, a stretcher team from another company evacuating survivors. One of the medics, a gruff man with a Bavarian accent, knelt beside Emil and asked, "Still breathing?" Emil nodded, barely. The medic said nothing else, just lifted him onto the stretcher, as if picking up someone already halfway to the other side. The truck ride back was long and jarring. Every bump lit his shoulder on fire, but he didn't care. Through half-lidded eyes, he watched the frost-covered trees pass by. He whispered her name, again and again. Lotta, Lotta, Lotta. Like a prayer, like a spell. He spent 2 months in a field hospital west of Kiev. The arm was saved barely. He would never raise it fully again. But he could walk. He could speak. And more importantly, he was going home. The war had taken too much. He was no longer needed at the front. He had done his duty. Whatever that meant now. In the spring of 1944, Emil boarded a medical train heading west. Every mile felt like a breath he'd been holding for years. When the train finally pulled into Dresden station, he stepped down onto the platform. Thinner, older, haunted, but alive. A survivor, though he never liked that word. He expected ruins, smoke, maybe silence. But what he found was the sound of piano music drifting from a cafe still standing. And then he saw her, Lotta, standing at the far end of the platform. No flowers, no dramatic tears, just there. Her hand over her mouth, eyes wide, the photograph clutched in her hand now too. She had never stopped carrying it. She had never stopped waiting. They didn't run, they didn't shout, they just walked, slowly, like the world needed to see it happen, like time itself had waited for this. He fell into her arms, not with strength, but with surrender. She whispered, "I knew you'd come back." And for the first time in years, Emil let himself cry. Not for pain, not for fear, but for everything that almost kept him from this moment. He didn't know how long he'd have, whether peace would last, but he had this. He had her, and for now, that was enough. Time has a strange way of blurring the sharpest edges. Scars fade, memories soften, names once whispered on cold nights dissolve into silence. But some things, a handful of them, outlast the noise. Like an old photograph, worn at the corners but still intact, still holding a life inside. By the 1980s, Emil Hartmann was just another quiet old man in a small house on the edge of Dresden. He walked with a slight limp. His right arm, once shattered by shrapnel, never fully healed, but he lived. He married Lotta. They had 2 children, 3 grandchildren. He became a shoemaker again, not because he had to, but because shaping something by hand, something that stayed, gave him peace. He rarely spoke of the war, not because he wanted to forget, but because he didn't want to trap anyone else in it. Still, the photo never left his wallet. Even when the leather cracked, even when Lotta begged him to frame it, he refused. He needed it close. He needed to feel the paper between his fingers sometimes, just to remind himself, "I came back." Then one summer, on his 65th birthday, his granddaughter, Anna, asked him the question no one else had dared. "Opa, is it true that this photo saved your life?" Emil paused. He looked down at her small hands holding the image, the one he'd carried across frozen fields through fire and blood and silence. The same image that had stared back at him on the night he nearly vanished forever. He smiled, not the practice kind, but the kind that rises slowly from a place deep in the bones. "Yes," he said softly. "She reminded me I was still a person, even when I didn't feel human anymore." He didn't tell her everything, not the details, not the cold, not the noise, but he showed her the back of the photo, the handwriting still faint, but there. "Come back to me." Then he took a deep breath, steadied his voice, and said something he hadn't said aloud in decades. "I almost didn't." There was a silence, but not a heavy one. Anna reached across the table and held his hand, and in that moment, Emil understood something. His survival wasn't just his. It belonged to them now. His children, his grandchildren, every heartbeat that had come from that choice not to pull the trigger. Every smile, every story, every ordinary day that once seemed impossible. Before he died, he wrote one final letter. He placed it inside a box, along with the photograph and the old wallet. The letter wasn't addressed to anyone in particular. It was more of a confession and a gift. It read, "If you ever feel like you can't go on, if you ever reach for the end instead of the next step, remember this. I held death in my hand. I looked it in the eye, and I came back. Not because I was brave, but because I saw a reason to live. Find yours, hold it tight, and if you can, become someone else's reason too." The photo now sits in a museum in Dresden, unassuming, tucked behind glass, next to a pair of cracked soldier's boots. Most visitors pass it by, but a few stop. A few lean in close. A few read the line written on the back and feel something stir. Because the truth is, war doesn't end with silence. And survival isn't the end of the story, it's the beginning of a legacy. And sometimes the difference between life and death is a single image in a wallet, and the memory of someone who believed you'd make it home. If this story moved you, keep it alive, like, share, leave a comment, let the world remember Emil Hartmann, and all those who were saved not by weapons, but by love, memory, and the quiet power of being seen. Because heroes don't always wear medals. Sometimes they carry a photograph. Subscribe, not for the numbers, not for the channel, not even for me. Do it for Emil Hartmann, for the man who held on when everything told him to let go, for the photograph that saved a soul in the middle of hell, for every forgotten soldier whose story still waits in silence. Subscribe to honor them, to carry their memory forward, to say, "You were not lost, you were seen."